Hello and welcome on our second live stream of How to DAO course, which we are running together with Network State Connect. Here on the call, we have Gideon, who is tutoring the DAO course with me. And we have one of our students actually here as a guest, Adam Miller, also founder of MIDAO, focusing really on incorporating DAOs on Marshall Islands. So Adam, welcome.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here.
We are midway the course. How you feel about it? How you are enjoying working with others and stuff like that?
It's awesome. On two levels for me, the course is great. One is that my whole company is taking it together, which is awesome, especially for those of us who have less experience with DAOs and Web3, including our newest employee who's starting in a couple of weeks and has never been in Web3 before. So I could see every new employee at our company taking the How to DAO course, for example, as a way to get into DAOs. And I think other companies should consider that too. And then for me personally, it's awesome partly because, having been running a DAO focused company for 3 years, I get so focused on my specific part of DAOs, which is already a specific part of crypto and Web3, that I sometimes lose track of just the expansive set of everything happening in DAOs. And so it's really awesome to get reconnected a bit with why DAOs? What are DAOs? What are people doing with DAOs? What's it like starting a DAO from both a social, political, and business and an on-chain perspective? So for those reasons, I really enjoy it too.
No, that's amazing. And, you said it yourself, like you are in the DAO space for the last 3 years. So I would say pretty advanced, but it was great to see how people who are one of our employees, very new to crypto, and people like yourself, a little more experience, are working together to actually creating a DAO, which was the last homework. And now, the discussion basically on the call was almost like a discussion about governance proposals out of nowhere. We didn't initiate it, but it just started behaving like a DAO. So it was fun to watch. This live stream, it's called legal entities and different organization structure for DAOs. Yourself, you are focused mostly on Marshall Island DAO. So can you maybe give us a little background on Marshall Islands? Maybe you can also mention where they are, because I was surprised the time zone difference there is, and what are the biggest advantages they are offering?
Yeah, sounds good. So I'll tell the story of how we started MIDAO, and I'll touch on the Marshall Islands as part of the story. So about just over 3 years ago, I was working on starting a tech company to build DAO tooling. I was just a few months in, and some of the DAOs I was working with had this challenge that they needed to form a legal entity for reasons we can get into later, but we needed to form a legal entity. And we looked around the world at all the popular options, Delaware, Wyoming, Cayman Islands, Switzerland, etc. And every single option had downsides from our perspective. So one of those downsides was the requirement to have a board or management team. And of every legal entity in the world required that. And we didn't necessarily want to, in the long run, have a board of our DAO, maybe councils and stuff like that. So that was one thing. Another big thing was we wanted to wrap the entire DAO. We wanted the token holders to be members of the company or owners of the company, but not to have to KYC, not to have to give their name and address. And every law in the world required companies to track the names and addresses of their owners and members, because that was just the way people did things until, blockchain. And so we reached out to a senator we knew in the Marshall Islands. Now, the Marshall Islands was a former German territory in the 1800s, a Japanese territory in the 1900s, a US territory during World War II, and then gained its independence from the United States in around the 1970s. The Marshall Islands remains an incredibly close ally of the United States. It's actually considered a freely associated state, which is not a state, but they actually get to use some U.S. services like the Postal Service, the Department of Agriculture, FAA, the Aviation Authority manages the airports. So, and in fact, if you ship something to the Marshall Islands, it looks like an American address. But it's an independent nation with its own laws, its own jurisdiction. The U.S. has no jurisdiction there. Marshall Islands also, for several decades, has been a leading jurisdiction in the shipping industry. So there are New York Stock Exchange companies that are Marshall Islands corporations There's about 70,000 companies registered there. It's actually bigger than the Cayman Islands in that regard. And so we went to the senator in the Marshall Islands that we met a couple of years prior and said, hey, how would you like to expand your country's expertise from shipping into DAOs and Web3? And this kicked off the conversation that led to, over the past 3+ years, passing multiple laws, creating a regulatory framework. Originally built for DAOs, we've now realized actually it's a good legal framework and legal entity for Web3 more broadly. It's called a DAO LLC. There's a nonprofit and a for-profit option. It's actually the first nonprofit LLC in the world of any kind. So forget about the unique blockchain and DAO characteristics, but it's the first nonprofit LLC in the world. And we built it for DAOs and Web3. So over the past 3 years, we started MIDAO, which stands for Marshall Islands DAO. That's the company that's commercializing this legal entity, spreading the word around the world, helping people set up and maintain these entities. We act as actually the book of record for the registry, for the government, of all the registrations. And we have over 200 projects now that have either signed up or already created their legal entities in the Marshall Islands, mostly Web3 and blockchain related projects, a lot of DAOs, but not all DAOs. That's how this came to be.
That's super cool. Like you basically help Marshall Islands, the nation, going this route, if I understand the story correctly. So I think like not many people can say like that, initialized basically like a Web3 revolution in a nation. No, this is great. And you mentioned this non-profit LLC for DAOs, and I know this is also a big thing for A16Z because they help the Wyoming, the DUNA law to pass. And I would say some of our listeners might be familiar with the Wyoming LLC or non-profit LLC or non-profit entity type of regulation. What are the main differences between like incorporating DAO in like Wyoming and in Marshall Islands?
It's a good question. So there's kind of two questions to think about when you're incorporating a DAO or any project or organization. One is what jurisdiction you want to be in, right? So do you want to be in Wyoming or Delaware or Cayman or Marshall? Two is what legal structure do you want for your entity? Because, and not every legal structure is available everywhere. So for example, there's no Cayman Islands LLC, and there's no Delaware Foundation, and there's no Marshall Islands Foundation. So you're kind of limited sometimes between, for example, a DAO LLC is available in Wyoming and the Marshall Islands. There are some differences. The DUNA is currently only available in Wyoming. We're considering passing a DUNA law in January. It's not yet obvious to me whether the DUNA is going to be successful and popular. So we're not sure if we should do it or not. We're trying to figure out what the demand is. So we could go into like nuanced differences between any of these different structures and jurisdictions. But just to try to keep it really simple, between the DUNA and Marshall Islands DAO LLC, I would say, first of all, you're choosing between incorporating in the United States and offshore. And so for a lot of people, they do not want to base their project in the United States because of either current or perceived future regulatory challenges, whether it's securities laws, other crypto laws, et cetera. Now that's changing potentially with the new administration coming in the United States, but that hasn't happened yet. Another thing is that the DUNA is an UNA, which is called an unincorporated nonprofit association. You actually do not register a DUNA or an UNA with the state. You do it on your own separately. That's why it's called unincorporated. And that has some pros and cons. I mean, one pro is that you don't have to talk to the state at all. The con is because the state doesn't even know you're doing it, there's no way for third parties to verify that that company really exists. So it's hard to do things like open bank accounts and other TradFi and exchange accounts and stuff like that, because there's no way for a bank or an exchange to validate that your DUNA is real. It doesn't mean there aren't some banks, probably in Wyoming, that might bank for you, but it could create challenges around the world. And actually, the UNA itself is not even recognized in most jurisdictions. And so we don't know yet, will a German member of a Wyoming UNA receive liability protection from the UNA? It hasn't been tested yet. And it's possible that it hasn't even been tested for UNAs themselves, right? Let alone DUNAs. And then maybe the final thing I would say is, well, first of all, there's some nuanced differences in the governance structure we could get into, maybe beyond what we want to go into today. One thing that hasn't been tested about the DUNA is that even though it's called a nonprofit, when you create a DUNA, it's actually taxed as a for-profit corporation in the United States. If you want to, and so that's full corporate taxes, right? If you want to try to get nonprofit status, you then later have to apply to the IRS, the American Tax Agency, for nonprofit status. And no one's done that yet. We don't know if the IRS is going to give nonprofit status to Dunas or not. Whereas with the Marshall Islands DAO LLC, same with Cayman Foundation, Swiss Association, et cetera, it's a very established kind of like nonprofit structure that you get out of the gate. You don't have to like get it and then apply for nonprofit status. So it's going to be really exciting to see what people do with the Duna. Nouns is going the route of the Duna, which is a leading DAO, I would say. It'll be exciting to see how it goes. But those are some of the differences.
And Adam, I mean, these are very interesting substantive differences. Kind of to go back a little to the human journey here, right? So you saw an opportunity in the Marshall Islands as an entrepreneur, and you're building this business right now. But aside from the business opportunity, what as a human interested you about this space, and why did you think, for maybe ideological reasons, maybe that this is something you want to contribute to?
That's a great question. I think there's two answers. One is about why I'm so passionate about DAOs and how that led me to work on this. And two is why I'm passionate about the Marshall Islands and why people should be excited about supporting the Marshall Islands as well. So let's actually start with the Marshall Islands. I think it's a shorter story. The Marshall Islands is a small country. Because of the nature of its land, it's actually almost completely flat. I'm trying to remember, there's this kind of inside joke that there's the tallest mountain on the island is this like 6-foot tall pile of trash. What that means, though, being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I never mentioned it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, kind of between Hawaii, Australia, and Japan. Climate scientists project that literally the entire country will be underwater in 50 years. Literally, the entire country. And the only chance for this country to survive is to spend about $50 billion on land reclamation and seawalls. And no one in the world, no nonprofit, no international agency has come close to saying they'll be able to support that kind of work. The only way for the Marshall Islands to survive as a physical nation, now it'll be interesting, maybe the first network state could come from a situation like this. It's another story if a country loses its land. And they're talking about this at the United Nations. What happens when a country loses its physical nation? But meanwhile, the Marshall Islands is looking for revenue opportunities. They want to find ways to innovate as a country to generate revenue. And so by working with the Marshall Islands and anyone who chooses to incorporate in the Marshall Islands, right, this is a way of helping literally save a country. Back to the DAO side, why am I so excited about DAOs? When I was working at my last job 3.5 years ago, I was working for a big American finance company doing tech research on crypto for them and cybersecurity and AI. And I realized I had to leave and get into crypto professionally because it was just too exciting. And so I spent a year studying everything about crypto in terms of what could you work on in crypto? What jobs could you take? What companies could you start? Media, podcasts, layer ones, layer twos, DeFi, DAOs, other types of dApps, NFTs, right? All these different things you could do. And DAOs stood out to me as both the most exciting for my personal interests and passions and a really good time to start a company because it was definitely early. Now, will it be too early? I don't think so. We'll see. I mean, DAOs have not taken off yet to the extent that all of us dream that they will and expect that they will. But I really wanted to be early at something. And I felt like 3 years ago, even still, frankly, it's not too late to be early in DAOs for anyone listening. But 3+ years ago was also definitely early. But why are DAOs so exciting to me? It's really because they bring, I'd say, two things. So one is that they operate at the intersection of people, technology, and business. And I've always just personally been interested in that intersection, especially between technology and people, which is where a lot of business emerges. That was always a skill of mine, was just to be able to kind of connect, like, for example, developers. We didn't even call them developers when I was growing up, but like developers and business people, and allow them to collaborate to create. Like, I helped create a lot of businesses' first websites, right? They literally didn't have a website, and there was no Google and or Yelp or something like that. And so this is just even more extreme in terms of being at the intersection of technology and people, because it's designing technology systems for people to coordinate. And so that's just exciting to me. I think the other thing is more on the cultural or philosophical side. DAOs enable much more democratic forms of organization. They don't force you to be more democratic, but they allow you to be more democratic. For the first time, right, we have the prospect that the next generation of like big tech companies or big tech products, Facebook, Google, Uber, whatever, will be governed in a much more decentralized way by much larger groups of people, governed and or owned. And I think that will lead to better outcomes overall for society, even if less efficient. Like a lot of people, like if I talk to TradFi people, are like, yeah, but why would you want everyone to vote on everything? And you don't have to have everyone vote on everything, but by spreading that power more widely, it may be harder, but it'll be better. It's like, do you want to live in a democracy or do you want to live in an autocracy? And I think most people in the world, especially if you've experienced the autocracy, you want to live in the democracy, even if it's slower, even if it's harder, even if it's complicated sometimes.
Democratization, I could very easily imagine that for public goods, right? Because and even there you could say there's already a change we can make because a lot of public goods might be suboptimally produced. There might be limited oversight. Civil servants might go rogue. So there's already the question of how well democratically participated are these public goods in their creation process. But private goods, you could say, well, is there a need to distribute, let's say, participation and ownership there? Because, well, maybe the private good that you make is not for everybody. It's a very specific vision that only a small team can execute on. What would you say about that?
My first thought is that DAOs and the technology we're building will blur the lines between public and private. Because today, I think generally when someone says public or private, what they mean is like, is it driven by the state or driven by individuals? And public is like driven by the state. You could argue that like big nonprofits are public, but they're controlled by like 20 people sitting in a boardroom. So they're really private, even if charitable or nonprofit. So I think what DAOs do, right? So the only place we've really instituted much more democratic forms of governance are at a huge scale because it's expensive to do, right? If Microsoft wants to hold a vote of its shareholders, it costs millions of dollars and takes months, literally, right? When America wants to hold a vote, we only do it once every year or 2 years because it's too hard to do more often. It takes months. It takes all this energy and effort and way more than millions. I mean, I don't know how many countless billions of dollars to hold a national election. Well, now suddenly it's pretty much free and instant. I mean, I know they have technically blockchains. Yeah, we're still scaling. We're still working out the kinks of wallets and whatnot, but like we're close to free and instant voting at a global scale. And so that will allow us to institute voting and democratic forms of governance at smaller scales of organization, not just at the nation level, not just at the large corporation level, but in the medium level. And so I think we'll see, again, combined with the network state idea, which we could get more into if you want, but I don't think there's just going to be like private and public. I think we're going to have this whole spectrum of things that we own and govern and are a part of that range from the most private to the most global and public, and we'll participate in different ways with all of those things.
Yeah, and we had another student, Josh, last week on the Spaces, and he talked a little bit about that, like how the technological kind of process like evolve means like the technology itself, but the rules, how we govern the nation, it's just still the same like it was 200 years ago. And we should probably think about it that now we can vote instantly from the basically home. You just need to own your wallet, where is your KYC kind of thing, so I know that I'm me and I can prove it. And I think it's where everything is heading. Like I like your view on like that it will be kind of blending like the public and the private, because I think it helps many causes to just kind of institute a little bit of business thinking into the like public sector, and maybe some like of the public thinking, like the impact thinking into the private sector. One example, which is non-crypto, but there is an initiative, Matthew Diamond, it's kind of promoting it, called water.com. So they are like trying to, bring fresh water into developing nations because it's a big, health factor and stuff like that. And what they realize is like they like cannot just give money because they don't have enough. And if they are providing loans, the private sector is not like supporting it, because for them it's like it's a business, but it's like a public thing, so we use different money for that, and they cannot wrap their head around kind of like how to combine those things. But I think that's super powerful if we actually use the private money for the impact driven initiatives. And as you said, like DAOs can be the vehicle to do it, and I'm definitely excited to see Do you already see some examples like that, like where kind of the business thinking and the public good kind of impact is going like together?
Boy, that's interesting because I mean, I almost hate to admit that I think still a lot of what's happening in crypto is a little bit insular from like mainstream. You know, we're still experimenting with these forms of governance and organization, mostly when it comes to crypto related projects, things that are happening on chain, you know, open source software, that kind of thing. And so I'm trying to think if there really is a good example. I mean, maybe some things like Ukraine DAO, you know, getting people together to support causes that are important to them could be a good example. And that was some time ago now. But no, honestly, I still kind of struggle. I don't know if you guys have good examples, but I kind of struggle to think of really great examples of DAOs that have really gone mainstream. I think it's going to happen soon. You know, if you look at the history of crypto, you know, and I've been kind of following it since 2012 when I, you know, first found Bitcoin. We've gone through these waves of increasing adoption where you 5 to 10x the adoption each wave. Well, guess what? We're at 10 or 20% of people who at least hold crypto. Maybe they're not all active on Web3. The next 5 to 10x, which was hopefully happening in the next few years, brings us to mainstream. That brings us to 100%. And I don't know if it's hard for people to imagine, but like for me, just this morning, I was thinking about the evolution of Facebook and social media. I have never forgotten because I have thought about this ever since it happened. We went from 1 year, most people said, why would you ever use social media? Why would you ever do it? It makes no sense to me. I don't understand it. I don't know how to do it. I'll never touch it. You kids these days and all your stuff. And then it felt like overnight, maybe it took 3 to 5 years, but it felt like overnight, everyone was using it. And now younger people don't even use it anymore. We moved on to the next thing. And so even though it's hard to like, I still don't know how like my neighbor who like doesn't understand any of this stuff and like it kind of refuses to understand it, which is similar to Facebook and social media too. I think he does understand it, but he refuses to like accept it. We're going to get them. I don't know exactly how. Pretty soon they're going to jump on board. And that's when I think the adoption will come. But I do think it's notable that even, I mean, again, I wonder if you guys have good examples, but even me working in the space professionally, there aren't really a lot of examples I can think of DAOs going mainstream yet.
Yeah, but like, you know, like as you said, like people already, like kids already move to new thing, you know. We on like us on this call, we are still on Facebook, but you know, like the younger generation don't even know what it is. They just like watch probably like TikTok video, and maybe there is something we actually don't know about which they are using. Regarding the DAOs which went mainstream, I don't think mainstream, like I don't think any really went mainstream in the way that like they had impact all the way and this exists. But like one example, good example is Constitution DAO, because they went mainstream in the way that like they went into all the publications, you know, Wall Street Journal and New York Times, I think, published article about them, because it had like real world impact. They, you know, wanted to buy the Constitution. They raised $42 million, I believe, within a week, which is crazy to think of. But it's great showcase of the power of DAOs and like crypto in that sense. Like you can get money from anywhere instantaneously and nobody can like, you know, stop you. Because I think what people don't think about much, it's like if we would like to do it on the like financial like banking rails, we would probably need some approvals like to actually receive such an amount of money. You know, like then like if the money will be just flowing into account, the bank will just like probably close the account because it's you know, risky and I don't know what. But now we are controlling our own financial system, and if we want to send money somewhere or, you know, do this crowdsourcing, basically we can. So that would be the example I would use. Like DAO went mainstream even though they do not exist anymore. Gideon, do you have any example of yours? I know you've been part of some DAO, so maybe something like you feel like, yeah, it kind of went mainstream or had impact.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, on the one hand, there's the DAOs that are known as DAOs because they were born in a crypto native environment, right? So Constitution DAO are obviously people that made a lot of money in the crypto space I mean, not all of them, but let's say, as a crypto elite that came together, and then quickly a lot of people tagged on, and this became a broader movement in a very short time. What I find interesting is it's another corner in which actual, let's say, legacy organizations are experimenting with these new types of collaboration, right? So I definitely see interest in the organizations that have been established for quite some time, both public and private. And yeah, a small example of that is the Dutch National Police, right? So I've been working with them. Obviously, this is a organization you would not expect to invest in these types of collaboration tools, but they're very interested in it, and they're trying to build out a new strategy capability that way, to say, hey, the way we think about public safety in the country of the Netherlands should be informed by the public in a better way, and should be open to all types of innovation that people are actually working with right now. So how do we kind of increase our agility and increase the amount of information and interaction we have with our citizens and people in the security domain? Well, we can learn from DAOs, right? And I think as soon as that type of thinking starts to become more commonplace, you can also see a broader impact, right? So it's almost as in the crypto space itself. Nobody really wanted to talk about the TradFi institutions, or there was some hate towards them. But now that they're stepping in, we see a lot of things changing. Even government, of course, is stepping in now, right? So the same thing could happen in DAOs potentially. And, I think this could also be an interesting question for you, Adam, is like, if DAOs hold this promise almost to democratize or liberate or help people participate, yeah, how would you see that in the context of legacy organizations? As a small example, the consultancy company I built over the past decade, thinking back of that, and in the most recent years, I was like, why didn't I start it as a DAO? If I would do it today, I would start it as a DAO. But, consultants are not used to work or think that way, not completely at least. So anywhere from consultancies to national governments, where do you see legacy organizations adopting these principles or practices? Do you think it's going to happen anytime soon?
It's a good question. I mean, I think back to when I was working at Capital Group, which is the big finance company I worked at, and there was this cultural push to drive decision making and innovation to the edges of the organization, and to give more, if not hard power, soft power to implicit power to people at every level of the organization. But I think, and so there's that cultural trend, I think is consistent across the corporate world, but it's still pretty limited. I mean, you maybe do like a competition or a prediction market, to figure out like what everybody's thinking, or to crowdsource or almost crowdfund like projects within an organization. But at the end of the day, I don't really see most legacy organizations willingly giving up their power. I mean, like in the company I worked at and many others, let's say either 21 or 20 or 100 people are in charge, like have a majority stake in the company. Even if you're talking about a big public company, that's still a very entrenched system of governance that, unless you buy it from them, they're not going to just give up their power and their right to their share in future profit. So I think where most of this innovation will come from is it's disruptive innovation. It's finding the new opportunities. It's competing with these older institutions and older companies until we start to beat them and push them out. And the next generation of the most successful, maybe they won't be called companies next time, but kind of like how today these big tech companies that were started 10 to 20 to 30 years ago are the biggest companies in the world. In 20 years, the biggest wealth generation vehicles in the world will be DAOs and crypto and protocols and stuff like that. And they'll have market caps that are way higher than Google and Apple and Microsoft and those types of things. But I don't see those organizations changing that much. I see us having to compete with them and fight with them and push them out. And maybe some will change, especially once they see the writing on the wall. I think a lot will try to. It's like 10 years ago, especially, every public company or Fortune 500 company was saying, we're a tech company now, right? Yeah. Everything's tech. It's not about making dishwasher detergent, it's about technology. And it was, maybe they really believed it. Maybe it was a little bit of a marketing thing. Like sometimes they really believed it. Maybe a similar thing will happen, but I think most of the innovation will come from the outside.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of feel it on that one because so 10 years ago, probably, I worked a little bit with a Volkswagen group in their innovation hub. So it was like actually like it was not like the core Volkswagen, but it was their like top innovation hub. It was so slow. Like you couldn't do anything there. I was like, this is really like how innovation happens that I need like 15 approvals to change the icon. Like, come on, like I don't know how you will survive. And now,
You got
well, I told you so.
Yeah.
So, some might see the writing on the wall, but some might not. And like, yeah, you give great examples. Like the top, 7 companies basically started like 20 years ago, or they were small startups 20 years ago. And, the big ones like GE, they are, not there and they had to like reinvent themselves to just survive. And they are definitely not thriving.
But maybe could I just weigh in there for a second
Yeah.
because I think it's also important to note. Like I just looked up GE and Volkswagen's market caps. These are 50 and 150 billion-dollar companies. Like they're not struggling. Maybe they think maybe it feels like struggling. They're just one order of magnitude lower than the tech companies, right? And I think what we're building with blockchains will be one order of magnitude bigger than these tech companies that came before. They'll be worth 20 or 30 trillion dollar market caps. Google and Microsoft will be fine, but they'll still be 2 trillion or 1 trillion or half a trillion.
Yeah. Well, on that note, like there was the time, I think like a year ago, 2 years ago, where, Mercedes was very struggling. They are still not great, or Daimler Group. And their market cap was so low that like if Elon wants to buy them, he doesn't need to even ask the board approval at Tesla because it's basically like pocket money. And like I was like, well, that's kind of funny because like now you can like basically buy all the other car companies just to be under the one umbrella if you want to. Yeah, but I agree. Like they are definitely still there, employing a lot of people, and like people who work for them, like probably have a good time. It's just not on the top anymore. I totally agree with it. So, like, what do you think? Like, it's the well. Let me get back what I actually wanted to say. So we had a conference in Bangkok with Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, and one of the very interesting comment there was from Josh, Joshua, founder of Meta. They are doing a research, and they are actually realizing that DAOs are more effective than big corporation. And why is that? Is that we are seeing on the all the mess in the DAOs, and we are like, this is not efficient, like it's too slow and everything. But in the big corporation, the mess is happening as well. However, in many silos, so you cannot see it, and also the decision cannot be really made like on the company level because like it's one department here and way more bureaucracy basically happening all over the place. So I think like we are like complaining that DAOs are inefficient. That depends who you are comparing it to. Like, yeah, 5-person startup, yeah, probably. But like you can still make 5-person DAO, which will be similar efficient as your startup. So like my question here is like, do you think there will be like DAOs which are also running like very efficiently, like at the beginning, and maybe then like getting into more like this governance games which are taking longer but are maybe more sustainable? Or how you feel about like the point what I'm trying to make? Should people start the company like their startup with like 3 co-founders as a DAO right away, or should they wait and then turn into DAO later on?
Boy, that's a tough one, but I will first agree with you that DAOs definitely can be and maybe are generally even more efficient and faster than traditional organizations, especially at scaling. And you brought up Constitution DAO. That's a good example, right? I think you made the point. If you tried to raise $42 million and buy something at Sotheby's using a traditional legal and organizational system, it would take months, maybe longer. Just literally, and by the way, it'd be very expensive. You'd have to hire lawyers and to spend a lot of money to do it. But Constitution DAO formed an organization, raised $42 million, and took an action for a week. That is faster than any traditional organization could have done that. And so, and another example I think of is more theoretical. There may be specific examples. You actually made me think of this for the first time, but the ability for people who are governance rights holders or owners of a DAO to quickly change their minds and completely shift the direction of an organization is probably way faster than any large organization today shifts, because the small group of people who are really in charge are less, I think actually in some ways less likely to quickly change direction than a big mob of democratic voters. Like, think about countries. Sometimes countries they go way left, they go way right, they do something, they go to war, they do these extreme things because it is kind of like more of a mob mentality, which maybe has negative implications too, or negative kind of feelings around it too. But yeah, I do think that in some situations, maybe many in the long run, DAOs will actually be faster and more efficient than traditional organizations. Now, should you start out as a DAO? I mean, that's an interesting question too, because I think there's two ways of thinking about what is a DAO. There's the more technical side, like, are you doing your membership tracking with a token and your governance on chain and your treasury is on chain? And then maybe it's just two people, each with a 50% vote, or three people with 33% vote. I think that is a DAO. And that's, even one person using blockchain technology for their organization. I think that is a DAO. Now, another way of looking at what is a DAO is more like, well, one of the things people are doing today with this technology is they're trying to be larger groups of people, more decentralized and distributed governance and ownership. And should you try to do that from the beginning? Maybe not. I mean, I think it really does depend. Sometimes the beauty of a DAO is you can get a bunch of people together and get them to start working before they are as aligned as a traditional small group of founders would be, because they know they have governance rights. They don't have to know out of the gate exactly what they're going to do. They know that they get to help decide over time. So, okay, I'll put my money in now, I'll put my time in now. So that can make sense sometimes. I think other times, I mean, let's say you're just one person who's like, I want to build this amazing product and I can build it in the next, like the MVP in 2 weeks. Maybe don't decentralize that first, go build the product. Right. And so I think it can make sense to go either way, just depending on the situation and just depending on what you want. Right. I mean, a lot of this comes down to, like, if a group of 3 people was sitting around even 10 years ago, they get to decide, do we want to do this as a nonprofit or a for-profit? Right. Do we want to have all of the profit or none of the profit? And it's just a personal decision. Which route do you want to go? It's not necessarily better or worse. I think similar with DAOs, do you want the group of people that is making the decision? Do you want to do things in a more decentralized way? Do you want to create more of a public good? Do you want to crowdsource as much as possible? Or would you rather just do things yourself and be in charge? I mean, you kind of get to decide.
And then, Adam, right? Imagine that as a group, you do decide that you want a DAO, and to go even further than that, you want to, I don't know if you'd have to fly to the Marshall Islands to incorporate, but you want a DAO in the Marshall Islands. You don't? Okay, so that's great. Now, one of the benefits that you described was on the Marshall Islands, you can basically have a headless organization, more or less, right? If I understand this correctly. So that's one of the aspects. The other one is that those that are in a governing position do not have to reveal themselves through KYC per se. Now, what assurances does that create if this DAO is going to work with suppliers or going to certain risky businesses? Who is responsible eventually, and how does this work in the legal system? Can you help us with that?
It's a good question. So, we make possible at MIDAO having a legal entity that can be very Web3 values aligned, very decentralized, no managers if you don't want to have managers, or an algorithm or an AI that's a manager, which is an interesting newer thought process. But to your point, let's say the DAO wants to form a legal entity and open a bank account with a traditional bank. Well, that bank is going to ask you, who are your managers? Who's in charge of this thing? And do you want to be able to tell them, here's our 3 managers? Or do you want to have to tell them, well, we don't have managers, this is something new, and now the compliance process of opening that account is going to be much more difficult. Now, increasingly, and we're actually trying to help drive banks to be more open to these new types of structures. But to your point, whether you want to do things in a very new and innovative way, it may cause some challenges for you down the road, or whether you'd rather do things in a more traditional way, like even the Cayman Foundation, that's more traditional, right? I can't deny that. Like, if you have a DAO with a Cayman Foundation, well, the downside is the board is really in charge. Now, they might promise to do what the token holders say, but like that, for a real Web3 person, that is not what we really want with like autonomy and decentralization, but maybe it's good enough. And now when you go to open a bank account, the bank, and actually it's hard to open a bank account as a Cayman entity too, but at least the bank can look at your board and say, oh, this is the board. These are the people who are in charge. They've KYC'd, et cetera. So it can be a tough decision, how decentralized you really want to go. And maybe to dig a little deeper, let's say we're talking about liability issues. So some laws, especially if we're talking about, let's say we're talking about criminal acts, especially. If there's a criminal act, all that matters is who's involved. It doesn't matter if you're hiding, if you're trying to hide, you better try to hide well. It doesn't matter if you only have 1% governance rights and 99 and maybe other people voted yes too, but like you're the one who made it happen. Like if you're in court in front of a judge and a jury and they can show that you're the one who made this criminal thing happen, whatever subjective manner, you're going to go to jail, right? And now there's more of a middle ground where we're not talking about just like a regular corporate action. We're not talking about a crime, but let's say it's like securities laws, for example, or like commodities laws, which especially in the US, but Europe too, can be very restrictive in some other places. They also will tend to sometimes hold the people in charge accountable. Now, will they be able to figure out who's in charge? Maybe, maybe not. Is anyone in charge? And that's actually, so like to a lot of lawyers that advise the Marshall Islands DAO LLCs will talk about substance and form. Now, maybe your form is your legal entity is totally decentralized and it's very distributed and no one's in charge. But if the substance is that, well, really these three founders who started the thing are basically in charge. Like everyone just, you can tell, even if they don't have any tokens, it's obvious to the jury that they were in charge, they could still get in trouble, right? So there are these kind of like, even though the legal entity makes it possible, whether you want to do it or not, and whether you are truly operating in a decentralized way or just pretending to, are still important considerations.
Well, my advice would be don't do anything illegal and you are kind of out of trouble. But like, I know that like the regulation can be blurry, but like just try to stay out of jail. It's just easier to, but no, it makes sense. Like, and what I also like hear from you, Adam, it's like banks are the problem. Like, like open a bank account, it's hard. Then you might consider different structure. But like, my answer to that is like, if you actually a DAO, you already have a native bank account or right attached to it. So like, why you even care about banks at that point? Because your native bank account, it's yours and nobody can debank you. So I feel like that's maybe also one of the advantages of DAO. Like you have very sovereign bank account attached to the organization. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but I think for a lot of DAOs, that's enough. But also for a lot of DAOs and Web3 projects, you're going to need to interact with the TradFi system. Maybe you want to hire someone or sponsor an event or buy a piece of property, and the person you're interacting with just doesn't use crypto yet. I think that'll be a problem less and less as time goes on. And there's other ways to solve it, that require some trust, right? So let's say you're mostly decentralized, but because you need a bank account, you're going to open a Delaware LLC and get an American bank account in Delaware and put 3 managers in charge. And that LLC and those managers are committed to acting in accordance with the DAO's wishes. And the DAO just sends money to that bank account when it needs to. Doesn't give all the money, but when it's trying to buy something for $1 million, send $1 million to the bank account. If those 3 people really want to commit a crime and try to steal the money and evade law enforcement, they can try. You are trusting them, but that's hard to do and usually doesn't happen, especially in the developed world. So maybe that's a good middle ground solution. But no, you're right. Especially in the long run, the fact that you don't even need a bank account is one of the amazing innovations of Web3. But also a lot of organizations still seem to want one.
And, we are both part of Bankless DAO, or it used to be Bankless DAO. So I think we now it's Black Flag DAO, but we still have that kind of mindset like banks are the evil.
Yeah, banks and... Look, to be fair, a lot of banks are responding to control and influence from the US government all over the world, right? Because they're all connected so deeply to the US Fed and Treasury that can just take away their account or freeze their account at a moment's notice. You kind of have to do what they say. And so, yes, banks are the direct problem, but I think indirectly, the US government, which hopefully this will change very soon, has been the reason that a lot of banks are difficult to work with if you're in crypto.
Yeah, Agree with that. As we are wrapping up shortly, we have like 5 minutes. Gideon, do you have any last question maybe for Adam, or also comment you would like to make?
Yeah, I mean, the last thing you touched on is, things might start changing with the incoming administration. I heard a New York Times podcast today that said this might be the most pro-crypto legislative and executive branches that's been there since forever. So yeah, how is that going to impact, do you think, the world of DAOs? Also, maybe more specifically, your business? Yeah, because we want to keep supporting the Marshall Islands, but what if people start doing everything in the US now?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's going to be great for crypto. I think almost without question. It's hard to know still exactly what that means. At some point, the US Congress will have to write and pass a law that's going to have pros and cons. It's not going to just say, do whatever you want in crypto. It's going to regulate crypto. It's going to say, if you want to launch a token, here's the things you have to do. Right? It's not going to be pure positive. I think when it comes to DAOs, one thing that stood out to me was about 2 years ago, President Biden and his White House produced this 100-page paper on like direction for crypto policy. And it did not mention DAOs or anything related to DAOs a single time. And it was 100 pages long. So I think DAOs are not the number one thing in the spotlight of the federal government and like politicians at the highest level. I wouldn't be surprised if the first set of laws and regulations are more about tokens and DeFi and securities laws and stuff like that, which will apply to us in DAOs. I mean, most DAOs have a token, which you need to deal with securities laws. But maybe like the specific DAO stuff will come a couple of years later. We'll see. To your specific question about offshore entities in the Marshall Islands, yeah, for us, the US being very pro-crypto has a good and a bad effect potentially, right? The good is it's good for crypto and DAOs in general. The bad is maybe people feel less afraid of the United States and less interested in creating an offshore entity. Now, what we can fall back on, I think, is that even in the traditional corporate world, it's extremely common for people to have entities all over the world. In VC, I read a stat that like 75 or 80% of American venture capital companies have at least an American and a Cayman Islands company, because there's just these benefits. Like, for example, if a investor from Dubai participates in an American company, that investor has to file things with the IRS, file things with the US government. And so if they can invest in a Cayman entity instead, they will. And then no one's really trying to do much to change that in the United States. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's still as much of a need and a use for offshore legal entities for a lot of reasons, even if the US becomes more crypto friendly and therefore people are less generally afraid of the United States.
Sounds perfect. And Adam, a last question, where people can find you and find MIDAO and maybe consider incorporating DAO in Marshall Islands.
Yeah, for sure. So MIDAO is MIDAO.org or MIDAO on Farcaster. I'm TheThriller on Farcaster. On X, unfortunately, we are MIDAO DS for directory services because someone had MIDAO already. And I am 0xThriller because someone had TheThriller already. But those are the places you can find us. And through our website, we have a new docs section where you can read about all the details and you can contact us through there, or obviously feel free to just reach out to me directly.
Nice. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Puncar H2D on Twitter because someone already had Puncar there, and the account is not used, but I cannot convince Twitter to give it to me. Hopefully in the future. Gideon, where people can find you?
Yeah, well, luckily my mother gave me a very unique name with the 2 I's. So it's just my first and my last name without any space. It's Gidion Peters.
But not on Twitter. He's more on LinkedIn because he's a boomer.
What can I say? I'm such a trad boy.
Thank you guys. This was fun, and happy holidays to everyone. And we will reconnect these live streams in New Year with Futuarchy. This is kind of the new type of governance with one more student of ours and one secret guest. So looking forward to that.
Thank you guys so much.
See you in New Year.